So this is work actually that I did with some partners in Iraq and in Zimbabwe. And it was on the back of some work that we did during COVID. But this was a project that was commissioned or asked for by Internews, which is an organization that works with journalists. So the intention of it was to produce some research that could help them to think about what should they be doing and how should they be working in thinking about some of the informational challenges around climate change, specifically in humanitarian communities. So stepping outside the UK, sorry I missed some of the presentations because I had to lecture this afternoon, but yeah, this is, I think, hopefully going to be an interesting complement or entry point into some of this work. So the original work that we looked at was when there was sort of all of the hype around COVID and we were trying to sort of figure out and make sense of the importance of the information environment. It was me and some partners in South Africa start to raise some questions about, well, what are people actually doing with information? When should we be concerned about a conspiracy? Does a conspiracy about Bill Gates mean the same thing in Nigeria as it means in South Africa? If not, why? And so we really tried to sort of situate and try to look at, well, what's going on with these things? How do they sit within people's wider information environments? And when and how should we care? And do we need to be approaching it in the same way everywhere? So that sort of gave way then to this next project, which I'm not going to go into the insights of the previous work, that's not what I'm presenting, but you can look, the papers are open access. To the second work, that was to sort of think then again about, well, coming out of that work were sort of two basic premises that became the foundations for how we sort of approach this additional work around climate change. And the first was the idea that to understand when and how misinformation matters, you need to understand the local information environment. These things take place differently. Why people pay attention to things is going to vary. And it's not just about the individual or the information or even the channel, but we need to think a bit more broadly about how people engage with information. And the second was that if we pay attention to the information environment or ecosystem, and not going to get into defining that, but we could, we can learn a bit more about, well, like, the degree to which misinformation matters. Let's not start with misinformation. Let's start with the information environment, situate misinformation within that. We can learn why and how people engage with it. And actually, that can help us to do research. That can actually help policymakers to make decisions about what to do. Telling them that there is X amount of people, this sort of conspiracy circulating, doesn't help us to understand, well, like, how to pre-bunk, what messages address. In Nigeria, for example, some work we did showed that things are politicized by opposition politicians, but wasn't the same way in South Africa. So you won't know the counter messages or even why people pay attention to conspiracy unless you know that context. So we thought, well, if that mattered around COVID, we raised two questions then on the back of Internews' concern about what's going on around the information environment, around climate change, especially around communities who are sort of on the front lines of climate impacts. And so the wider study, which we did between June and August, was centered around these two questions. So what is going on around local information environments in some of these communities that are affected by climate impacts? And then what does that mean for how should we respond? And I'm going to focus a bit more on the first and then think about that in the context of what then as researchers we might want to think about. So in approaching this work, there's a couple of things to think about quickly in terms of what matters. Why would we care about misinformation in the context of climate change? What might be distinct in thinking about it versus other issues? Can we just go straight from looking at it in COVID to climate change, or what's distinct? And there are sort of three things here that I think are, I think this captures some of the dynamics that I think as academics we should really keep in mind. So it's a cartoon of a Western academic on an ivory tower saying, as a woman, I understand all your needs in the fight for climate justice. The marginalized majority below saying what, which I think sort of paints an indication to some of the issues that were sort of our starting point for thinking about how might we want to conceptualize what's going on here. So the first being, there is a concern with misleading information around climate. Climate denial is a thing we are very familiar with. That there is sort of something to be looking at. There is sort of misleading information here to be concerned about. But when it comes to thinking about even beyond the statistics of when and how the sea level is going to rise or temperature is going to change over a certain amount of time, there is actually a lot of, uncertainty between some models, but also there's uncertainty about what to do with it and how to respond, and what knowledge matters to respond well. I think, I'm not sure who remembers the case in Colombia back in June when there was the 4 children in the plane crash, that's the plane crash, and they managed to survive. A lot of the discourses around that was, well, why were they able to survive in the Amazon after the plane crash? It was because of what they were talking about then, so their indigenous knowledge from the communities they were from. So climate change, there's sort of thing when it comes to responses, what knowledge is useful? And where does that knowledge come from? And I guess importantly for us then too is what role then does particular forms of scientific, sorry, I didn't do that to play within that. And I think the other sort of thing that we wanted to keep in mind was that there's a lot of injustices around the causes of climate change and the responses. And injustice mixes with the information environment in ways that don't make it so straightforward. So that was sort of our framing point. Then in terms of locating the study, we focused on two contexts, central and southern Iraq and southwestern Zimbabwe. And we have researchers in person in both locations from both areas. I'm going to only talk about Iraq because we have very limited time and I like to talk. And so these are both areas where climate change impacts are immediate and they're happening now. So Iraq is seen to be the 5th most vulnerable climate country. Where we were looking at, there were sort of 3 communities that we focused on. One, the buffalo farmers around the Chibaish marshes, which I think the UN estimates 70% of the marshes have dried up, and there's sort of high levels of migration. This is an area where there has been the political drying out of the marshes, but the sort of degree to which it's happening now is completely unprecedented. We also looked at rice farmers in the area as well, which came out as in wider work and then also in our interviews, no longer have enough rice of amber rice, which is local to the area for the seed banks, let alone for consumption. And so there's the idea that within 2 years, the rice just may not be there. And then we're also looking at some of the urban areas in Basra, Baghdad, and Nazira around dust storms and side effects of the oil industry. So these are really communities where it's very current, and what we wanted to know was not what is what is sort of going on and what are the informational needs around climate change here, but what are the needs and where should and how should we be concerned in the areas that are on the front lines of what is happening. And yes, it's not the only place we will all be affected in different ways, but this is where we located our study. And I think thinking about where we locate our studies and who are the audiences that we have in our minds when we're doing our research is probably also important to think about. So this is very much exploratory. We only did about 50 interviews in the 2 locations. They were done in person. We did some informal interviews around it. So these are not intended to be representative of the information environment in Iraq. It's more just to raise questions about, or hypotheses about how should we be thinking about what's going on. Okay, so what did we find? So again, I'm going to try to just highlight some of the sort of high-level points here of what we found that I think hopefully are relevant for thinking about it in wider conversations. And the way I've put my slides is these are quotes from the interviews that have been translated, rather than sort of my points, just to give an indication of what we were seeing and how it was spoken about. And I guess just to keep in mind, the way we did the research was that we started by asking people about long-term changes in their environments that they saw. We didn't use the words climate change, so we didn't want to sort of preempt a particular type of discussion. So the first thing we found in Iraq was that people tend to get information through oral forms of communication. There wasn't a lot of local information around what was going on around the climate change impacts or how to respond to them. But there was a huge desire for practical information about how to act and a sense about to look for it anywhere. One of the things we started to see was some of the elders in the community starting to listen to young people in the community who they saw were on social media, not because they saw social media or young people as informative, but because they just wanted information anywhere. This was an unprecedented situation they found themselves in, so there was a desire just to find anything that could work. On the other side of it, there was also a high level of mistrust in the information environment. So especially around the assumption around anyone who's considered to be tied to politics or seen to be political. And there's a sense that what they were saying was not going to have the local interest at heart. There was also going to be some sort of external interest at play. So they wanted information from anywhere. There was a huge desire for practical information, but also a sense that, especially from outside the community, from national sources, anyone involved in politics, the international community, there's a suspicion about where their interests lie. There was also pretty much, even when I was following the researchers to push for this, very little discussion about false or misleading information. There was some narratives in Iraq about blaming Turkey and Iran for the water shortages, so a slight geopolitical dimension there. But mostly the concern was just, there's no space for denial because we're living this. the idea was, the sort of the narrative that was coming out was, this is a problem of weeks, not months. In weeks, we are going to either have to move or we're going to sort of die out. We have no other option. And so in that sense, the privilege almost of a misinformation wasn't there. And so it wasn't, where we might be thinking about climate denial, there was no climate denial, but the whole focus was on, well, what do we do about the situation that we find ourselves in? And so we think about sort of the scope of information needs and where perhaps misinformation might be problematic. It's on that side that we found. So it was, we're living this is happening. And instead, the sort of two needs that sort of came out, I think of the interviews were, one, on one side, a sort of interesting mix of both fatalism. I think that first quote really encapsulates it well, is that, like, we don't know what to do, and there is nobody, we aren't seeing anyone taking action. And then on the other side, a desire to really do something. And I think one thing that was quite striking among the buffalo farmers was all but one interviewed said that if we just had water, we could survive. We know what to do in our environments, but we just need water. And so there was a sense that they didn't necessarily need a lot of information, that they knew what to do, but also what the change in their environments was new. And that was what they didn't know what to do with about it. And the other side about it, which I think, I don't know where we come in as academics in the middle of this. But the other thing was that despite, there's been a lot of attention in climate change debates around Iraq. It's not that like Iraq is not in the media, it's not that Iraq is not getting support around climate change. A lot of sort of the shift of funding has moved to this space. But in central and southern Iraq, especially in the southern areas among the farmers, there was a sense they don't see the politicians, they don't see any NGOs. And there was this idea that they're just all at international conferences and talking about it, and they don't know what's going on here, and what's happening here is not feeding back up into it. And so there was that sort of gap in that we know there's money somewhere, it's not getting here. And one thing that was sort of interesting as well was there was some interviews that commented that, of course, politicians are acting, they're never here, they have no idea what's going on. So in that sense, if they don't know, they also can't act. Our information is not getting back to them. So in terms of the needs then, and how they sort of framed what was needed in the information environment, sort of sum it up in sort of three things. One, locally relevant and actionable information. So it's not just about information being true, it's about information that we can use. And especially in Iraq, because of the mistrust, we want to see results. We want to see that this works. What that looks like, don't know, but it was that sort of narrative. Second, information about rights and demanding rights, especially around the oil industry. There's a sense that, like, we can protest, nothing is going to happen. And then third, that point about linking up local information to governments, NGOs, and international actors. It's not just about getting science communication down to local communities, but it's how are their experiences and their understandings of what's going on in their environments feeding back up into the international discourses. And then the one, it was not many, but one or two did comment that they were concerned with the potential for misleading information in the intense desire for actionable information and the fact that people were looking for information anywhere. And that sort of desperation doesn't drive a skepticism, but it drives a potential, and there's a potential risk there, especially when we're thinking of both immediate and longer term climate impacts. So what does this mean then? What do we do about it? And I know I'm moving quickly, but I want to give us all time. I was sort of trying to reflect on what I see might be interesting for us then in thinking about research and how we sort of frame our studies. The first was that this combination of combining misinformation with both relevant and useful information, especially around crises like around some of the climate impacts. Second, not treating our audiences as passive, but people actively engage and shape information. And I think there can be sort of an implicit hierarchy that we impose in how we talk about people and audiences because of what they believe and why. And actually, that feedback was really important, even for building trust and engagement and also getting that useful and relevant information. And then the third is the idea that information environments are not just about one-off behaviors in the immediate time, but people are talking about, we're thinking about their information needs both now, but also future generations. And so climate change paints this sort of interesting situation where we need to be thinking about, and I don't know how we do that in our studies, and it's here. Is in the second point here is in our studies, is how do we think about the outcomes of behavioral change? Do we think about it as one piece of information and what people do in the back of that? Or is it about thinking about making decisions over time within an information environment and that enables people to make informed decisions across a changing situation? And I think climate change really paints that as being important. And then the other 2 points on here for implications of research was starting from people's experiences and different contexts. I think it was quite striking. I hadn't worked with researchers in Iraq before, and it was quite striking to see some of the things that came out. And then the sort of third point about a multidisciplinary approach, not new to any of us, but these ideas of thinking about trust and mistrust, power dynamics around information access, active audiences, that's very big in media and communication studies and sociology, and I think has a lot to offer in sort of thinking about and possibly informing some of our responses. So that's it. I'm going to stop there. I don't know how long I took, but hopefully I kept it in. But thank you.
So thank you very much for that. We probably have time for one quick question or a medium question. Go on, Hassop.
Thank you. I'm curious as to where the Iraqi academics fit into the picture here.
So that I don't know. So we were working with an independent academic, so she wasn't in an institution. And because it was through internews, we didn't engage with the universities locally. I mean, the one thing that we found was a lot of the studies have been done, and that's a good question. If we develop, I think we need to work with Iraqi universities. A lot of studies have been done in the Kurdistan region in the north, which is why we located our studies in the south, because there's been less access, so at least it's been seen as safer and easier to research in the Kurdistan region than in the south. But we didn't work with Iraqi. We worked with an independent academic for this. And that was, be perfectly frank, it was timing. They gave us the money in April. They wanted the results by August, and so we had to work with who we could get. Once you get the ethics done and serve into it, it was very fast. But I would do it differently. I would work if we're able to expand on this work. Thank you.
Thank you, Raj. I think we're going to pause that there. If you have any more questions, you can approach Steph afterwards. But without